right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Nessum Show. Today, I have a great guest with me, especially for all the pre-law students. We have Steve Schwartz, who is a longtime professional LSAT coach and the author of several LSAT guides. He's most well known for creating the popular test prep site Lsat blog and hosting the Lsat Unplugged podcast and YouTube channel. A little bit of background on Steve. He went to Columbia for undergrad. After improving his score from a 152 to a 175, on his own LSAT, Steve decided to delay going to law school as he found he enjoyed coaching the LSAT just way too much. So thanks for coming on today, Steve. I'm sure a lot of students are going to get tons of value.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam. Great to connect with you.
Absolutely. So first question to you is, how did you get involved in LSAT teaching? Can you bring me back to, I guess, you were studying at Columbia for undergrad and what that process was like, and then making the leap to being a full-time LSAT coach?
Yeah, sure, Adam. So basically, I was looking into law school myself. I majored in political science, and so law school was a natural next step a lot of folks take. And I started studying for the LSAT, and I got a 152 on my first diagnostic practice test. And I was doing pretty well in school. I did well on the SAT. I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school. And so getting a 152, which is just about an average LSAT score, was really discouraging for me, because I thought I was good at standardized tests. I thought I was a good student, and getting right in the middle was not going to get me into my dream schools. And so I ended up getting obsessed with this exam. I took exam after exam after exam, and my scores would just not go up. I was tracking them with spreadsheets. I was Googling everything I could find on all these old forums and such, but nothing was really clicking for me. I finally adopted the mindset of trying to deconstruct and dissect the LSAT to better understand it from the test maker's perspective. And that's when my scores started to improve. Over what ended up being an entire year, I ended up achieving the 175 and started teaching the LSAT to friends and classmates and such. I started tutoring it as well. I had always tutored other exams in the past, like the SATs from New York. We have the Regents exams for high school. And so tutoring came naturally to me. So I just started teaching the LSAT, and it went really well. I loved it. It was way more interesting than other material. And so I just kept teaching and never ended up actually submitting my application to law school. In fact, my law school personal statement draft was 99% about why I didn't like law in most ways, but only liked one particular way. My brother was like, sounds like you don't really want to go to law school. And so I didn't go, and have been teaching it ever since.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you found what you were truly passionate about at the time. I feel like one good takeaway amongst many that you already just gave is kind of, you got to follow whatever your path and passion may be. And if that changes last minute, there's nothing wrong with that. So how did you, as a student who scoring a 152 originally, figure out this system that worked for you? Can you expand on what those approaches were that you figured out and how that could be applied by other students that may be struggling?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I fell into a trap that I see so many students fall into, where they get obsessed with the instant feedback. Take a section, take an exam, score it, get those results. Be happy or sad about them, and then move on. I call this the obsessive practice exam narrative. The idea that taking exam after exam is going to lead to some magical big breakthrough. And in a way, it's actually easier to just take exams, especially for the LSAT, where there are 89 numbered exams, all chronological. So a lot of folks will start with exam number 1 and just move forward from there. But that's working harder. Working smarter would actually be slowing down, taking fewer exams, and reviewing them in more depth. And so when I changed my approach from just taking lots of exams and scoring them and moving on, hoping that volume would achieve the result, and instead I realized, let me actually look at what I'm getting wrong and why. It seems obvious in hindsight, but in the moment, it's actually really hard to do. It's grueling because, you know, from your work with the MCAT and such, right? These materials are hard. These exams are hard. And especially for something like the LSAT, and you could tell me what you think about your world, but on the LSAT, it's like, it can really make you feel dumb to get things wrong, because it's English, it's words on a page. Why isn't it clicking? So you could spend an entire hour going over one problem in depth. And when I do that in my classes all the time. In fact, I have a reading comp class tonight where we're gonna spend an entire hour covering just one reading comp passage, not even doing the questions, just going line by line, word by word, sentence by sentence, deconstructing the material. And I do that in class because I want to pave the way for students to do it on their own, because it's hard to do it on your own. It's easier to just try to solve them, and whether you can or not, score to move on.
I think that's a great point, and there's actually a lot of overlaps with that and MCAT instruction. When I have my students in our program, what we tell them is by far the most important thing you're going to do to improve your score is reviewing that exam. I don't care what you get on the test. I don't care how badly you're doing on practice questions. It's the review that is, if you skip that part, you're not going to see the improvements. Yeah, you'll see maybe small incremental improvements just because you're doing more questions, but that review, it can make or break the difference between a top scorer and not. And so it's actually sometimes better to do less exams, because a lot of my students always freak out because I actually don't have them in the entirety of their prep do a absurd number of exams. I have them do a lot of practice questions, but not a lot of full-length practice tests. All the big ones that they should be doing, they do. But I say, I want you to focus more on the review. That could take a full day, if not 2 days sometimes, to really get everything out of it that you need. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, volume of questions is still important, but that review is just, if not more important. So that's interesting to hear. And so when you're breaking it down also, because I will say there's probably some differences between the MCAT and LSAT in the fact that a lot of times, let's say you get a question wrong on MCAT, there is some reading comprehension, but a lot of times it might also be, oh, I just didn't know that content, so I'm going to go and memorize it. How does it work for the LSAT, where I have to imagine it's tough sometimes because that exact question, you're never really going to see that content again, maybe the structure of it, but does that make sense? What I'm
Yeah,
asking?
I'm really glad you asked that, because the LSAT does not contain memorization. So that could be one key difference there. But there are certain patterns that repeat. There are certain question types. Like, for example, in logical reasoning, there's something like 15 different question types based on what's called the question stem. So they'll ask you to strengthen an argument or weaken an argument or identify the flaw in an argument. And so some students may notice trends where they have more trouble with flaw questions than with strengthening questions, in which case you've ID'd a weak area, drill flaw questions on the side to get better at figuring out exactly what you need to do to ID a flaw. It could be that you prephrase or predict the flaw, articulating it for yourself before looking for the description of it in the answer choices. But there's also repetition of concepts in terms of methods of reasoning in the argument in a question. And so there might be a correlation causation flaw in an argument, or an ad hominem personal attack, where you're attacking the speaker's personal background rather than the substance of their argument. And so if you have trouble with that kind of flaw, that could be a concept that's not particular to flaw questions, but rather that kind of argument in general. And so there are these patterns of repetition where if you review in depth, you will figure out your mistakes and know what to do next time around. I've put this together in what I call the Socratic review method, where you specifically look at the argument, the question, and the answer choices to see exactly where your misunderstanding stemmed from. It takes time, but it's worth it. And I actually have students write out their thought processes like they were writing actual explanations to explain to somebody else. It takes a lot of time. You can't do this for every single problem you ever attempt, and not even all the ones you get wrong, which is why I'll say do fewer questions in more depth, like we talked about. And I also recommend, like you said, not even doing a cold diagnostic. So you didn't actually say that, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. But what I was saying is, like, for the LSAT, because there's so much to learn up front and kind of everybody needs to learn the same things, I actually personally don't recommend doing a cold diagnostic before jumping in. I say we've all got to learn the same material, start from the beginning. You'll have plenty of time for practice tests later, and those initial ones can often be discouraging though. So I say, let's just take it apart piece by piece, step by step.
That's actually a great point. I did not talk about it, but I think we do have similar views on the diagnostic. So I have this theory that diagnostic exams are mainly for test prep companies, major test prep companies, to be able to say, look, you started here and then we raised your exam score this amount of points. But obviously, if you take an exam cold without ever doing anything, you're going to get an awful score.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might even, I could be wrong here, go more for because the improvement that most students will make on an MCAT from a score before they even start studying is so astronomical, because there's so much content you actually have to know. So if you don't know that, you can't even do anything really. And so I say a lot of times you can take it, but you shouldn't put any weight on that score, and you might as well just start diving into actually studying for the exam. Also, that point that you made about the Socratic method, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that and how you have students review, because we have on the MCAT a section called the Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills section. And basically it's abbreviated CARS, and that is like a reading comprehension section where you need to essentially figure out an author's argument, the main idea of the passage, and then there'll be questions based off of that, what certain things, whether it's supporting an argument or falsifying it, et cetera. So it's probably like a baby dumbed down LSAT section on the MCAT as well. So similar, I guess, to SAT, but a little bit harder. So what is that method you have students use to review?
Yeah, sure. So the Socratic review method is basically a structured way to review your mistakes or whatever gives you trouble. And so I'll give logical reasoning as an example where their job is to evaluate arguments. You have the argument, which is a short paragraph. You have a question stem, which is asking you to strengthen the argument or weaken it, etc. Then you have the answer choices. And so I say, don't just focus on the question stem. Don't just focus on the question type. Also look at the method of reasoning in the argument itself. So figure out what gave you trouble about it. Was it that it was difficult to identify the conclusion? Was it that they contained lots of conditional reasoning? Was it that they used weird words like unless, except, until, and without, which require some translation there, where there are multiple conclusions, like an initial evidence, a subsidiary conclusion, and main conclusion? Was there a counter premise? And I know I'm using technical LSAT language, but basically there are lots of structural parts to arguments. And if arguments are not simply evidence and conclusion, it gets a bit messy. So figuring out each of those pieces and dissecting them. And then, like I said, methods of reasoning. So it could be correlation, causation, flaws, and reasoning. It could be technical formal logic, where students may want to diagram. So there are lots of little things that can make an LSAT question difficult. And the more of those things you include, the tougher the problems get. And so a level 5 question will have maybe 5 tricks or traps in it. An easier question may have only 1 or 0. And so students are not all going to fall for the exact same tricks. So students have to figure out which tricks they are uniquely prone to falling for and focus on learning those better, reviewing those particular kinds of concepts in depth. And so if translating the word unless is difficult for you, figure that out so you can actually work on it instead of just getting questions wrong and not knowing why. Then for the answer choices on the LSAT, they're really good at making the right answer seem unappealing and the wrong answer seem tempting. And so figure out specifically.
The MCAT does the same.
Yeah, they're really masterful at it. They're devious and they love doing it. There's a certain love they have for tricking students. And so the more tricks they have, the tougher it gets. Students aren't going to fall for all of the tricks, or else they would be getting essentially a 0% accuracy rate or nothing better than blind guessing. And so figuring out which traps you're uniquely prone to falling for in the tempting wrong answers or the discouraging right answers. What about the wrong answer made it tempting to you? And what about the right answer made it seem unappealing? Focusing on that specifically in a systematic way, rather than just getting it wrong, looking at the correct answer in the answer key, saying, oh, I get it now, and moving on.
Completely agree. Yeah, it's gotta be some sort of systematic review. Otherwise, it's kind of like you're just shooting darts at a board blindly and trying to figure out how you're going to improve, but you don't really know how. I have a question, because I think this could help the MCAT students as well that study for the CAR section. Do you have students, when they read a question, go right into the answer choices? Do they need to go back to the passage, or do you have them kind of think about that question and what they need to do before moving on?
Great question. Yeah, I think a lot of students will, again, I'll use logical reasoning as an example because it's the most complicated section in certain ways. Like I said, 15 different question types. And so students, for many question types, they can actually predict the correct answer before looking at the choices. And a lot of times they'll read these arguments and they're confusing. They're dense, difficult text. They're meant to be. And so students will read it. They'll kind of skim, kind of get it, kind of not, be like, oh, I don't really get it 100%. Let me look at the choices and see if that helps. Right. And that never helps. It never helps because the choices. Glad we're
on the same
page. It's so funny how similar these exams are. I'm surprised, actually. I don't know much about the MCAT at all, so I'm curious to learn more. But the choices only make sense in the context of the argument. So focus on the argument. A lot of LSAT prep companies focus on drilling by question type, like flaw, strength, and weaken, because it's easy to categorize that way. But that's only of limited usefulness. Like I said, there are also methods of reasoning that cut across a wide variety of question types. Like you can strengthen a correlation causation argument, or you can weaken it, or you can just point out, hey, that's flawed. There are lots of things you can do with that kind of argument, regardless of the question type. And so understanding the argument in depth is actually really important. So I say slow down, focus on understanding it in depth. And then, of course, given the question type, you can make a prediction in many cases. For a correlation causation argument, you can strengthen it or you can weaken it. And so we can predict different ways you might strengthen or weaken that argument by downplaying alternative potential causes or promoting alternative potential causes, and then go into the choices looking with that idea in mind.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's great advice. That's basically what I tell my students to do for the cars section is I tell them if you go right into those answer choices, you're going to get more confused, not less. A lot of times you're just start now blindly looking for what sounds right, but what sounds right is not always going to be the right answer. So if you can go in with a prediction of what the right answer might look like, then you're kind of more focused in to pick up on the things that match that prediction and those that don't. And I also will say what I call the question behind the question is to rephrase what the question asks, because sometimes it's very confusing. There might be double negatives, these accept questions. So put it in your own words so it's clear in your head now what you're looking for once you go down to those answer choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're really good in those wrong answer choices at using the exact same words and phrases as in the argument. And so those wrong answers will seem even more appealing if you don't already have your own idea in your head in your simple language versus the exam's complex dressed up language.
Great. It's funny to see the similarities for sure. So in terms of students that I'm sure you work with a lot of students, some are great, maybe some aren't as driven. What are some of the commonalities that you see amongst the students that are the most successful in your programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely some key differences there. I think part of it is just getting legitimately interested in the exam, and even in some cases for the top scores, going so far as being obsessed with the exam and really looking to dissect it and think about the exam from the test maker's perspective to get into their mindset, thinking about how did they go about laying their tricks and traps for unwary test takers. What about the wrong answer made it seem appealing in the first place? Of course, there are some wrong answers that are totally out of left field. Like if you ask, who's the president of the United States? Homer Simpson is a clear wrong answer. But I could see maybe 1% of Americans saying George Washington because he was a president at some point. And so there are different levels of tempting in different ways. Or maybe saying Tony Blair, a former prime minister of a different country, technically was a chief executive, right? And so there are different ways and different routes or methods of reasoning you could go about to get to a tempting wrong answer. So thinking about how they lay those traps is actually really important. And then really owning the review process, not just passively looking up explanations or checking the answer key and saying, I get it, but actually going so far as to write out your review process or talk it out with a coach or a tutor or a study buddy, really taking the time, not just showing up to class and that's it. As you know, right, most of the work happens on the students' end outside of class. You got to put in the work to get the results.
Couldn't agree with you more there. I'm glad you brought up passive versus active studying. That's something I know you haven't been following my stuff for a while, but you'll see me push all the time is students and a lot of times it's not their fault, especially going from high school to college. They don't know the difference between passive and active studying. But when you're just reading and reviewing and highlighting and writing out, kind of just to no end, a lot of times that's very passive. When you're talking through something with someone and you have to actually explain it to them or teach it to them, now we're starting to go to those higher level, more active study strategies that will allow you to grasp and remember the material a lot better. So I totally agree with you there.
Yeah, you learn a lot by teaching others, and you really prove to yourself as well that you understand the material in depth. So it's a confidence boost as well. One of the latest things I've done in my courses is I've actually had students give presentations on their own review processes or how they walk through a question, or even writing their own simulated exam questions to think about how the test makers lay those traps. That's not all of that is going to be for everybody. Some of that's only going to be for the top scorers. But I think really taking the time to make the most of the class sessions as well and showing up is important. Students in our programs, they have access to the resources, but other obligations can get in the way. And so carving out that study time and making it a priority is really important.
For sure, for sure. So what would you tell students that are thinking about starting to prepare for the LSAT, or maybe they're not even sure if they want to be a lawyer? What are some things early on in, let's say, their college career while they're thinking about this as a potential path that you would give them?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the not being sure whether you want to be a lawyer. Talk to actual lawyers. That is number one. Do informational interviews. Just reach out to a bunch of folks, maybe on LinkedIn or other social media. You have to reach out to a lot of them, but some folks will be willing to chat for 10, 15 minutes and tell you a bit more about what their life is like. So figure out maybe different areas of the law that interest you, but have those discussions. A lot of lawyers will tell you just don't go to law school, period, because a lot of lawyers work really hard and aren't always happy. And so make sure that there is an area of law that you're interested in, that you're passionate about, that you really want to do, and that you know what it's actually like, not just TV or movie portrayals of the law, which could be a bit more exciting sometimes. A lot of this work is navigating difficult, dense text, just like the LSAT. And so in a way, studying for the LSAT can help you clarify, can you own this material? Can you learn to appreciate it in spite of, and also because of, its complexity? There's a certain magic to it once you can get it. It's obviously more fun if you get it than if you don't, but you can, through just taking it on the mindset of what can I appreciate about this, you can learn to enjoy it and respect it for what it is. Same is true of the law. Same is true of contracts. It's tough, but there is something special about it. For the LSAT specifically, I would say block off some time to make it happen. Maybe you're taking a lighter course load one semester or over the summer if you're still in college. A lot of folks will want to put in only 2 to 3 months when it really takes, in my view, 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the exam. These exams are often tougher than we expect at first glance. It's going to be harder than the SAT. It's going to be harder than high school exams or even college classes in a lot of cases, but it's important and it's worth investing the time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that on the timeline aspect. That's actually very similar to MCAT. A lot of students will study for about 3 months. I see the best results for students that can go for 6 months. On top of that, in regards to what you were saying with reaching out to lawyers, we said for students applying to medical school, one of the things we try to encourage is having them actually shadow physicians and being able to be with them for a day or a week at a time and see what the day-to-day life is like, because otherwise you're really not going to have a good understanding of the field. And that's actually one of the things admissions committees for medical schools look at. For law school, is there any type of apprenticeship or shadowing, even if it's just for a day or two, that students ever do to really get actual experience seeing what it's like to be a lawyer?
That would be awesome if that happened in the pre-law space. I don't think it's quite as common, or it's not the norm in the pre-law versus pre-med. But if you develop relationships with those attorneys through those informational interviews, hey, you could always ask. It wouldn't hurt to try. Having an internship or working as a paralegal can be nice to get exposure. Admissions committees do like to see some exposure to the world of law, again, in contrast to the media portrayals. It's not a must-have, but it is a nice-to-have. But any exposure you can get, even if you were able to say, I've done a dozen informational interviews, that would be huge. It requires some initiative, but it would give you a much better understanding of what law is actually like.
Got it. And then another thing I picked up on you said about seeing the different specialties within law or different areas is actually interesting because, and this is something I tell students all the time, while you need to love medicine as a whole, rotate in different subspecialties to get a feel for what it's like, because being a dermatologist outpatient is not the same as being an inpatient hospitalist. And so, or an emergency medicine doctor, or whatever it is. And so being able to find something that you like and see what your career might look like in the future is something that's important. And I've actually started working with lawyers more recently for my own company because I've needed to bring them aboard. And it's interesting to see how I'm getting passed from one lawyer to the next in regards to, oh, I don't really do labor law, or I don't really do IP. And so each person has their own specialty that they seem more passionate about. And so that's something that's interesting that I didn't really realize was within the law community as well. So
there are dozens. There are dozens of different specialties within the law. I couldn't even name them all. I mean, there's There's real estate, there's tax, there's labor, as you said, there's criminal, there's medical malpractice. There's all different sorts of areas that are completely different from each other. And good news is you can major in anything and go to law school. You don't have to be an expert in that area beforehand. And you could hate tax law. That's fine. You never have to touch it aside from maybe one class in law school.
Exactly.
You can ultimately focus in whatever you want. The one cool area, though, that relates to science a little bit is patent law. If you want to go into patent law, having that science background, if someone was a pre-med major or biology major and wanted to do a dual like JD, MD, that would be awesome. And law schools love folks with STEM backgrounds because it's fairly unique. Most folks are like me, majoring in political science or something similar.
Interesting. Well, so for any pre-law students, there you have it. You could always look into different areas. If you don't like tax law, doesn't mean you won't be a great lawyer and enjoy the field. So definitely make sure to look at everything. So now I wanted to switch gears just a little bit and hear about your experience going from what you thought was going to be a law school, and I don't know if it was like a corporate position that was in the future or whatever it was, to starting your own business and being an entrepreneur. How was that process for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I really just literally fell into it. I had no plan. I graduated from Columbia in 2008. Thought I was going to go to law school, got cold feet on it, talked to a bunch of lawyers who said it wasn't a good idea. And I also realized through writing my own personal statement that it wasn't the right path for me. I'd always loved teaching. I'd been tutoring the Lsat for a while. I've been teaching other subjects for even since high school myself. And so that was the world I knew best. And so I figured I graduated into the middle of the recession back in 2008. I thought, let me just keep doing this. I love it. So I'll continue. And little by little, it built and built and built. And in 2008, I started my website, the Lsat blog. And back in 2008, there was very little online about the Lsat other than some forums. And so just even posting one blog post a week, one article a week, it picked up really fast. I don't think you could do that today. Today, it's more about social like TikTok and Instagram and such and YouTube. But back then it was really just blogs. And so even getting found on blogs worked. So I kept doing it. And I found the more information I shared, the more folks found me and the more clients I got. So it worked out great. And I just continued from there without really a specific plan. Over time, I discovered how to create other resources like ebooks, guides, cheat sheets, checklists, and such. Then I created video courses, and now live online classes via Zoom is huge. And so I'm able to do that. And so the technology is kind of built over the years, and I've been able to use each medium to better serve students. And so it's worked out fantastically.
That's awesome. And how have you liked being kind of running your own business and dealing with that versus the actual teaching? Because I know those are two different things.
Yeah, they are two different things. I honestly love both of them because the actual teaching lets me connect with students one-on-one or in a group setting. And then for me, a lot of the business is really just putting out free material and people find me through that. There's not really a whole lot of other parts I need to do. I do have virtual assistants who help me in terms of getting the material out into the world. But for me, it's become where I really just create the resources and then they pull it in different ways. And so I'll have some folks make images on Canva for Instagram. I'll have other folks cut my videos into clips. And I've kind of taken them on over time because at first I'll say, this would be awesome if it happened. Let me do it myself. And then quickly I'll realize that after I've done one, I'm going to want to do 100, 1,000, 10,000. Can't do that all manually myself. And so I've learned to take a step back on those things and systematize them. It's been hard for me. It's been hard for me to let go and figure out writing the instructions and such.
I am currently looking into the process of hiring a virtual assistant. So I know what you mean, but I think at some point delegation is necessary when you're trying to grow a business.
Yeah, it certainly is. And that's really required conscious decisions on my part because the default would have been me doing it. And that just isn't going to work to achieve scale and put out the amount of material that I want and reach the number of people I want to reach.
Awesome. So do you have any future goals with where your program's going to go or other endeavors that you'd like to get into or expand or anything of that nature? Or where do you see yourself over the next couple of years?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I kind of just take things one day at a time. I do have plans and visions though. I mean, basically I used to do pre-COVID, I was doing 2 to 4 classes per month. Now I'm doing 2 to 4 per week. And so I think that's, people are showing up and that's been awesome. And my courses have been growing. And so I want to be able to offer more to my students in terms of more classes per week. So as a business person, I think getting more support to achieve that, like maybe having folks prepare the class materials for me so I can just show up and teach versus like edit the slides myself or prepare which questions we're going to cover in class myself or getting the recordings onto the course platform afterwards. So I would love to be able to teach a class theoretically, like maybe 5 or 6 nights a week. That would be a lot. I don't know that I always want to do that every single week, but it would be nice to have the system in place where I could do that if I wanted to, or maybe bring on other folks. Like I've done a lot of webinars with admissions counselors. So having a system to bring more of them into my world. I've also been doing more with my own admission stuff in terms of personal statement workshops and such. And so maybe bringing that in more into the course and providing more support on that side of things.
Love it. Well, I look forward to seeing it grow. Any last piece of advice for students out there, whether they're pre-law or just students in general, trying to figure out their career path?
Yeah, sure. I would say in general, like we talked about diagnostics earlier, cold diagnostics can be discouraging. Do not let your score define you, whether it's the Lsat score, MCAT score, or anything else. You can improve significantly from that. And while these test scores are pretty important in admissions, they are not the only factor. There are many other parts of the application as well. And you can be a fantastically successful attorney or doctor or anything else, regardless of what your test scores tell.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Steve. Where can the listeners find you?
So folks can find me at Lsat Unplugged on Instagram and TikTok. I've also got the Lsat Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast along with the Lsat blog.
All right. There you have it, folks. Go check them out when you get a chance.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.